The champagne glass slipped from my fingers, crystal shattering against the marble floor of the exclusive downtown restaurant as my son's words echoed through the private dining room. "Mom, seriously, you need to act your age. This is embarrassing." The laughter that followed from his colleagues felt like daggers, each chuckle a reminder that I had apparently become nothing more than an old woman who didn't know her place. I was Margaret Sinclair, 72 years old, and I had just been publicly humiliated by the son I had raised, educated, and loved unconditionally for 4 decades. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What made it worse was that this was supposed to be David's moment of triumph. His promotion to senior vice president at Morrison and Associates had been years in the making, and I had been so proud when he invited me to celebrate with his team. I should have known better than to share that story about his childhood science fair project, the one where he built a volcano that accidentally set off the school's sprinkler system. In my mind, it was a charming anecdote about his early creativity and determination. In his mind, it was proof that his elderly mother was losing her filter and making him look unprofessional in front of the people who could make or break his career. The silence that followed his outburst was deafening. David's assistant, a young woman named Brielle, who couldn't have been older than 25, actually covered her mouth with her hand as if trying to hold back more laughter. His direct reports shifted uncomfortably in their seats, suddenly finding their plates of herb-crusted salmon fascinating. Only David's supervisor, Richard Morrison himself, maintained eye contact with me, his expression unreadable behind wire-rimmed glasses. I bent down to pick up the larger pieces of glass, my cheeks burning with shame. This wasn't the first time David had made comments about my age, but it was the first time he had done it so publicly, so cruelly. Over the past few years, ever since his divorce from Sandra became final, he had grown increasingly dismissive of my opinions, my stories, my very presence in his life. It started small, rolling his eyes when I mentioned feeling tired after our weekend shopping trips, making jokes about my senior moments when I forgot where I put my reading glasses. But this felt different. This felt like a declaration that I was no longer worthy of basic respect. "Are you okay, Mrs. Sinclair?" Richard Morrison's voice cut through my embarrassment. He had risen from his seat and was extending a cloth napkin toward me. There was kindness in his eyes, genuine concern that made my throat tighten with unshed tears. "I'm fine, thank you," I managed, accepting the napkin and wrapping the glass shards carefully. "Just clumsy, I suppose. Getting old has its disadvantages." David snorted softly, apparently finding my self-deprecating comment amusing rather than touching. "Mom, why don't you head home? I can call you an Uber. The rest of us were planning to go to that new rooftop bar downtown, but it's probably past your bedtime anyway." Past my bedtime, as if I were a toddler who needed to be tucked in with warm milk and a story. I looked around the table at these young professionals, most of whom were probably younger than David's 38 years, and saw the mixture of secondhand embarrassment and pity in their expressions. They felt sorry for me. The old woman who didn't know when to stop talking, who embarrassed her successful son with her outdated stories and inappropriate timing. What they didn't know, what David himself had apparently forgotten in his rush to establish himself as a serious executive, was exactly who Margaret Sinclair really was. They saw an elderly woman in a conservative navy dress, someone's mother, who had overstayed her welcome at a professional celebration. They didn't see the woman who had built Sinclair Enterprises from nothing, who had turned a small regional manufacturing company into a multinational corporation worth over $200 million. They didn't know that the embarrassing, old woman sitting among them controlled one of the largest private fortunes in the state. David knew, of course. He had grown up in the sprawling estate in Westchester County, had attended the finest private schools, had his college tuition paid in full without ever needing to apply for a single loan. He knew about the trust fund that would transfer to him when I died, the one that currently generated enough passive income to fund his lifestyle indefinitely. But somewhere along the way, he had started taking it all for granted. The monthly allowance I deposited into his account, the down payment I had provided for his Manhattan penthouse, the stock options and investment portfolios that bore his name but remained under my control until the inheritance terms were met. Those inheritance terms. The lawyer who had drafted my will 20 years ago, Harold Pemberton, had suggested including certain provisions to ensure David would be mature enough to handle such substantial wealth responsibly. At the time, it had seemed like standard estate planning wisdom. David would receive full control of his inheritance when he reached 40 years of age, or sooner if he demonstrated sufficient maturity and responsibility as determined by me and a board of trustees. The age requirement had been Harold's idea, based on psychological research suggesting that most people don't fully develop impulse control and long-term thinking until their late 30s. Back then, David had been 18 and heading off to Princeton. The idea that he might someday speak to me with such casual cruelty, that he might publicly humiliate the woman who had sacrificed everything to build his future, had been unthinkable. The sweet, grateful young man who hugged me goodbye at the dormitory entrance would never treat his mother like an embarrassing burden. Or so I had believed. Actually, I said, standing slowly and smoothing my dress, I think I will head home. Thank you for including me in your celebration, David. Congratulations again on your promotion. I moved around the table, shaking hands with his colleagues and offering polite congratulations on behalf of the company. When I reached Richard Morrison, he held my hand a moment longer than necessary. It was a pleasure meeting you, Mrs. Sinclair, he said warmly. David is fortunate to have such a supportive mother. Family is everything in this business. Indeed, it is, I replied, glancing back at David, who was already turning his attention to his phone, apparently eager for me to leave so the real celebration could begin. Family loyalty and respect are the foundation of any lasting success. The Uber ride back to Westchester gave me 45 minutes to think, to process what had just happened and what it meant. I stared out the window at the city lights blurring past, remembering the last time I had felt this combination of hurt and determination. It was 35 years ago, when my late husband Charles had died suddenly of a heart attack, leaving me with a struggling business, massive debts, and a 3-year-old son to raise alone. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Everyone had expected me to sell Sinclair Enterprises, to take whatever money I could get, and disappear into comfortable widowhood. The company's board of directors, all men in their 50s and 60s, had made it clear they didn't believe a 37-year-old woman could handle the complexities of running a manufacturing operation. They had offered to buy out my shares at a fraction of their value, assuring me it was for the best. Instead, I had fired every single one of them. I spent the next decade working 16-hour days, learning every aspect of the business, from the factory floor to the executive boardroom. I mortgaged our house, sold my jewelry, and put every penny I could scrape together back into the company. David grew up seeing me pore over financial statements at the kitchen table, watching me take conference calls at all hours, learning that success required sacrifice and determination. By the time he graduated from high school, Sinclair Enterprises had expanded into 12 countries and employed over 3,000 people. By the time he finished college, we were the largest independent manufacturer in our sector, competing successfully against corporations 10 times our size. And through it all, David had been my motivation, my reason for pushing through the exhaustion and doubt and moments when failure seemed inevitable. I had built an empire for him, created a legacy that would ensure he never experienced the fear and uncertainty I had faced as a young widow. And tonight, he had repaid that sacrifice by treating me like an embarrassing relic who needed to be managed and dismissed. The house was dark when I arrived, its colonial revival architecture imposing against the starlit sky. Charles and I had bought this property when David was born, drawn by the privacy of its 10-acre lot and the potential we saw in its bones. Over the years, I had carefully restored every detail, from the hand-carved crown molding to the original hardwood floors. The garden that stretched behind the house had been my personal project, a refuge where I could escape the pressures of running a company and simply enjoy the satisfaction of nurturing something beautiful. Inside, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat in Charles's old study, surrounded by the leather-bound books and family photographs that told the story of our life together. There was David at 5, gap-toothed and grinning as he held up a finger painting he had made for my birthday. David at 10, serious and focused as he worked on a model airplane we had built together during one of our weekend projects. David, at 15, awkward in his first tuxedo before his school's winter formal, letting me fuss with his bow tie even though he pretended to be annoyed. When had that sweet, appreciative boy become the man who publicly humiliated his mother? When had respect and gratitude been replaced by entitlement and dismissal? My phone buzzed with a text message. David, of course. Thanks for coming tonight. Sorry if I seemed a little stressed. Big day and all. Talk soon. Not an apology, not an acknowledgement of how his words had hurt me. Just a casual dismissal of his behavior as stress-related, as if that somehow excused publicly calling his mother embarrassing and suggesting she didn't know how to act her age. I set the phone aside and walked to the wall safe hidden behind a painting of the Hamptons house we had sold years ago. Inside, along with important documents and emergency cash, was the most recent copy of my will and estate plan. Harold Pemberton updated it annually, adjusting for changes in tax law and asset values, but the core structure had remained the same for 2 decades. David would inherit everything when he turned 40, or when I determined he was mature enough to handle the responsibility, whichever came first. At 38, he had less than 2 years to wait for the automatic transfer. But the maturity clause, that was entirely up to my discretion, with input from the board of trustees I had established for this purpose. Suddenly, those inheritance terms didn't seem quite right anymore. If David thought I needed to act my age, perhaps it was time I did exactly that. Perhaps it was time to act like a woman who had built a fortune through careful planning and sound judgment, who had learned that respect was earned rather than automatically granted, who understood that maturity was demonstrated through actions, rather than simply achieved through the passage of time. I pulled out my laptop and began typing an email to Harold Pemberton. We needed to schedule a meeting to discuss some modifications to my estate plan. Specifically, I wanted to explore adding new requirements to the inheritance terms, conditions, that would ensure David truly understood the value of respect, humility, and appreciation before he gained control of the Sinclair fortune. If my son wanted me to act my age, I was going to show him exactly what a woman of my age and experience was capable of when properly motivated. The inheritance terms that had seemed generous and straightforward 20 years ago were about to become considerably more complicated. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the kind of October day that made Westchester County look like a postcard. I had slept better than I had in months, despite the events of the previous evening. There was something clarifying about finally acknowledging that the relationship between David and me had fundamentally changed, that the unconditional generosity I had shown him was no longer serving either of us well. I dressed carefully for my meeting with Harold, choosing a charcoal gray suit that projected authority without being ostentatious. At 72, I had learned the importance of controlling how others perceived me, especially in professional settings where age and gender could be used against women who weren't careful about their presentation. Harold Pemberton's law offices occupied the top 3 floors of a converted mansion in downtown White Plains, a setting that managed to be both impressive and comfortable. I had been working with Harold for over 20 years, ever since Charles's death, and he had guided me through everything from hostile takeover attempts to complex international acquisitions. More importantly, he understood the unique challenges faced by women who inherited wealth and power rather than being born into it. Margaret, He greeted me warmly, rising from behind his antique mahogany desk. You sounded urgent on the phone. I hope everything is all right. Harold was a few years younger than me, with silver hair and the kind of distinguished bearing that inspired confidence in nervous clients. His wife Eleanor and I had served on several charity boards together, and their family had become some of our closest friends over the years, which made this conversation both easier and more difficult than it might have been with a stranger. Everything is fine, I assured him, settling into the leather chair across from his desk. But I need to make some changes to my estate plan. Significant changes. I explained what had happened at David's promotion dinner, trying to keep my voice neutral and factual, even as the memory of his words continued to sting. Harold listened without interruption, his expression growing more serious as I described not just the single incident, but the pattern of behavior that had led up to it. This isn't about revenge, I clarified when I finished. This is about ensuring that David truly understands what it means to be worthy of inheriting not just money, but a legacy. Right now, he takes everything for granted because he's never had to earn it or risk losing it. Harold steepled his fingers, a gesture I recognized from countless strategy sessions over the years. What exactly are you thinking? The current terms already include provisions for demonstrated maturity. The current terms are too vague, I replied. Too subjective. I want specific requirements, measurable criteria that David will have to meet before he gains access to his inheritance. And I want the age requirement changed. Changed how? I took a deep breath, knowing that what I was about to propose would sound dramatic, possibly even vindictive to someone who hadn't experienced David's casual cruelty firsthand. I want the automatic transfer moved to 50 years of age instead of 40, and I want to establish specific benchmarks he'll need to meet if he wants to inherit earlier. Harold's eyebrows rose slightly, but his expression remained professionally neutral. 50 is quite a change from 40, Margaret. That's an additional 12 years David would have to wait. What kind of benchmarks are you considering? I pulled out a notebook where I had spent the early morning hours outlining my thoughts. First, he needs to demonstrate financial responsibility by living solely on his salary for at least 2 years, without any assistance from me or the family trusts. No monthly allowances, no emergency bailouts, no subsidized lifestyle. That's reasonable, Harold agreed. Many wealthy families have similar provisions to ensure heirs understand the value of money. What else? Second, he needs to show genuine appreciation and respect for family relationships. I'm thinking of requiring him to spend meaningful time with elderly relatives, perhaps volunteering at senior centers or participating in intergenerational programs. He clearly needs to learn to value older adults as whole people, rather than embarrassing burdens. Harold made notes as I spoke, nodding occasionally. And third? Third, he needs to demonstrate real commitment to something beyond his own advancement. Charitable work, community service, mentoring young people. Something that shows he understands that privilege comes with responsibility to help others. These are all admirable goals, Harold said carefully. But I want to make sure you've thought through the potential consequences. David is going to be shocked by these changes, possibly angry. Are you prepared for that reaction? I thought about David's face last night as he told me to act my age, the casual dismissal in his voice as he suggested I go home to my bedtime. Harold, I've spent 38 years trying to be the perfect mother, giving David everything he wanted before he even knew he wanted it. I protected him from every consequence, solved every problem, smoothed every rough edge from his path. And the result is a man who thinks it's acceptable to publicly humiliate the woman who sacrificed everything for his success. So this is about teaching him a lesson. This is about saving him from becoming someone I wouldn't recognize, I corrected. The David who spoke to me last night isn't the son I raised. He's become entitled, dismissive, and frankly cruel. If I die tomorrow and he inherits everything without having learned to value what he's been given, I'll have failed him as completely as any parent can fail a child. Harold set down his pen and leaned back in his chair. Margaret, in 40 years of practicing estate law, I've seen families torn apart by inheritance disputes, children who never speak to surviving parents again, siblings who become lifelong enemies, grandchildren who grow up hearing stories about how their grandfather or grandmother ruined their parents' lives with unreasonable demands. And I've seen what happens when wealth transfers to people who haven't earned the wisdom to handle it responsibly, I replied. David isn't some distant heir I barely know. He's my son, and right now he's on a path that's going to destroy any chance he has of becoming the man his father and I hoped he would be. We spent the next 2 hours working through the details, crafting language that would make my intentions clear while protecting both David and the estate from potential legal challenges. The new inheritance terms would take effect immediately, though David wouldn't be informed until Harold had finalized all the documentation. Under the revised plan, David would continue to receive his current monthly allowance until his 40th birthday, at which point all financial support would cease. If he wanted to inherit before age 50, he would need to meet all 3 benchmarks I had outlined, with progress evaluated annually by the Board of Trustees. The benchmarks themselves were detailed and specific enough that there could be no confusion about what was required. I want him to succeed, Harold, I said as we wrapped up our meeting. This isn't about making his life difficult. It's about making his life meaningful. I understand, Harold replied. And for what it's worth, I think Charles would be proud of what you're doing. He always said you had the strongest backbone of anyone he'd ever met. The drive home gave me time to think about how David would react when he learned about the changes. There would be anger, certainly, probably accusations of manipulation and control. He might even threaten legal action, though Harold had assured me the new terms were legally sound and well within my rights as the estate's current owner. But beneath the anger, I hoped there might be recognition. Recognition that his behavior had consequences. That respect was a requirement rather than an option. That the fortune he expected to inherit came with responsibilities he had never bothered to consider. My phone rang as I pulled into the driveway. David's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail. But avoiding difficult conversations was part of what had led us to this point. Hello, David. Hey, Mom. I wanted to apologize for last night. I was stressed about the promotion and I took it out on you. That wasn't fair. An apology. A real one, not the dismissive text he had sent the night before. For a moment I wavered, wondering if I was overreacting to what might have been an isolated incident brought on by professional pressure. I appreciate that, I said carefully. But David, this isn't just about last night. This is about a pattern of behavior that's been developing for months. The way you talk about my age, the comments about my stories being inappropriate, the general sense that you find my presence in your life burdensome rather than valuable. There was a pause. Mom, that's not true. I love you. You know that. I know you love me. I agreed. But love without respect isn't enough anymore. David, I'm 72 years old. I've built a successful company, raised a son, and managed to maintain my independence and dignity through some very difficult circumstances. When you suggest that I need to act my age, what exactly are you saying? That women my age should be silent? That we should disappear into the background and never risk embarrassing our children with our presence? That's not what I meant, he protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Then explain to me what you did mean. Because from where I was sitting, it sounded like you were telling me to know my place, to remember that I'm just the embarrassing old woman who doesn't understand how to behave in professional settings. Another pause, longer this time. Mom, you're being dramatic. It was just a dinner with my coworkers. You told that story about the science fair volcano, and it made me sound like a kid instead of a serious executive. I needed to redirect the conversation. So my memories of your childhood, my pride in your creativity and determination are embarrassing to you now? It's not about embarrassment, David said, frustration creeping into his voice. It's about appropriate context. These people need to see me as their leader, not as someone whose mommy still tells cute stories about him. Someone whose mommy still tells cute stories. I repeated his words slowly, letting them hang in the air between us. David, do you hear yourself? Do you understand how dismissive and cruel that sounds? Mom, I'm sorry, okay? I'll be more careful about how I phrase things, but you have to understand my position here. I'm trying to establish myself in a competitive environment, and I need people to take me seriously. I pulled into the garage and sat in the car, staring at the wall where Charles had hung his tools 40 years ago. David, I want you to think about something. Everything you have, your education, your penthouse, your investment portfolio, the connections that helped you get your job at Morrison and Associates, all of that came from the work I did to build Sinclair Enterprises. The woman you're embarrassed to be associated with is the same woman who created every opportunity you've ever had. I know that, he said quietly, and I'm grateful. Gratitude isn't something you say, David. It's something you demonstrate, through your actions and your choices. And right now, your choices are telling me that you've forgotten where you came from and who made your success possible. I ended the call before he could respond, not because I was angry, but because I knew anything else he said would likely make me more certain that the changes to his inheritance terms were not only necessary, but overdue. Inside the house, I found myself drawn back to Charles's study, to the photographs that chronicled David's journey from sweet child to successful adult. Somewhere along that path, we had lost something essential. The humility and appreciation that had characterized his younger years had been replaced by an entitlement that I had inadvertently fostered through my own generosity. I picked up the phone and called my sister Patricia, who lived in California with her husband and 2 grown daughters. Patricia had always been more direct with her children than I had been with David, setting clear expectations and enforcing consequences even when it was difficult. Margaret, how nice to hear from you. How was David's promotion dinner? I told her everything, from David's public humiliation to my meeting with Harold that morning. Patricia listened without judgment, asking occasional questions for clarification, but mostly letting me work through my thoughts out loud. You know what I think? She said when I finished. I think you should have done this 20 years ago. David has been coasted on your success for so long that he's forgotten it wasn't handed to him by divine right. Maybe I should have been stricter when he was younger, I admitted. Charles and I wanted to give him everything we didn't have, but maybe we gave him too much. Margaret, stop second-guessing yourself. You raised a son who graduated from Princeton, who's built a successful career, who's never been in serious trouble or made truly destructive choices. The foundation is solid. This is just about reminding him that respect and humility are requirements, not options. What if he hates me for this? What if he sees it as manipulation and cuts me out of his life entirely? Patricia was quiet for a moment, considering. Then he'll prove that the changes were necessary. A man who would abandon his mother for setting reasonable expectations about respect and responsibility isn't someone who should inherit a fortune without earning it. After we hung up, I sat in the gathering darkness of the study, thinking about the conversation I would eventually need to have with David about the inheritance changes. Harold would complete the legal documentation within a week, and then the choice would be David's. He could meet the new requirements and inherit early, or he could wait until 50 and receive everything without conditions. Either way, he would learn that treating his mother with casual cruelty had consequences, and hopefully, in the process, he would rediscover the appreciation and humility that had made me so proud of him in the first place. The woman who had built Sinclair Enterprises from nothing wasn't about to let her son's inheritance destroy the values she had tried to instill in him. If David wanted me to act my age, he was about to discover that women of my age and experience didn't accept disrespect from anyone, including their own children. The changes to the inheritance terms were just the beginning. 2 weeks had passed since my meeting with Harold, and the new inheritance terms were now legally binding. David remained blissfully unaware of the changes, continuing his life as if our conversation after the promotion dinner had resolved everything. He had sent flowers the day after our phone call, an expensive arrangement of white orchids with a card that read, "To the best mom in the world, love, David." It was a gesture that might have meant something if it hadn't felt so calculated, so perfectly designed to restore equilibrium without requiring any real examination of his behavior. I was arranging those very orchids in the kitchen when my housekeeper, Rosa, arrived for her weekly cleaning. Rosa had been with me for 15 years, ever since her youngest daughter graduated high school, and she could afford to reduce her client list to just a few families. She was a woman of my own generation, someone who understood the complexities of raising children while building a career, and over the years she had become more friend than employee. "Those are beautiful flowers," she commented in her slight accent, hanging her coat in the mudroom. "Special occasion?" "My son's attempt at an apology," I replied, adjusting the stems one final time. "He embarrassed me publicly and thinks expensive flowers will make it better." Rosa raised an eyebrow. She had been cleaning the house during many of David's visits over the years, had witnessed the gradual shift in his attitude toward me. "Mr. David is lucky to have a mother who built such a successful life. My children, they call me every week, to ask my advice, to tell me about their problems. They know I worked hard to give them opportunities." "Your children respect you," I observed. "They see your sacrifices as gifts rather than obligations." "Respect is earned, Mrs. Sinclair. It doesn't come automatically because someone shares your blood." Rosa's words stayed with me as I prepared for the day ahead. I had scheduled lunch with Eleanor Morrison, Richard's wife, who had called the previous week with an invitation to discuss a charitable project she was organizing. Eleanor and I moved in overlapping social circles, but had never been particularly close, which made her invitation intriguing. The restaurant she had chosen was discreetly upscale, the kind of place where serious conversations could unfold without interruption from paparazzi or social media posts. Eleanor was already seated when I arrived, her silver hair perfectly styled, and her smile warm but businesslike. "Margaret, thank you so much for making time," she said, rising to embrace me. "I hope you don't mind that I had an ulterior motive for inviting you to lunch." "I suspected as much," I replied, settling into my chair. "Though I admit I'm curious about what kind of project would require my involvement." Eleanor waited until we had ordered before explaining. "Richard was quite impressed with you at David's dinner," she began carefully. "He said there was something about your presence, your composure, that suggested someone with significant life experience and wisdom." I smiled slightly, remembering Richard's kindness when David had humiliated me. "That's generous of him to say." "Richard has been in the financial services industry for 30 years, Eleanor continued. "He's seen countless family dynamics play out in professional settings, and he's developed a theory about how certain personality traits predict long-term success or failure in business leadership." The conversation was taking an unexpected turn. "And he thinks David might be struggling with some fundamental character issues that could ultimately undermine his career advancement. Not his technical skills or intelligence, but his emotional maturity and interpersonal awareness." I set down my water glass carefully, processing this information. Richard Morrison was David's supervisor, the man who would decide whether David's promotion led to additional opportunities or remained the peak of his achievement. If Richard had concerns about David's character, it could affect everything David had worked to build. "What specifically concerns him?" I asked. Eleanor leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice despite the privacy of our corner table. The way David spoke to you at dinner raised red flags for Richard. In his experience, executives who treat family members poorly eventually extend that disrespect to colleagues, subordinates, and clients. It's a pattern that rarely changes without significant intervention. Has he observed this behavior in David's work relationships? Not yet, but Richard believes it's only a matter of time. David is still relatively junior in the hierarchy, so he's careful to maintain appropriate behavior with supervisors and peers. But Richard has noticed how David interacts with support staff, with younger employees, with anyone he perceives as having less power or status. There's a subtle arrogance, a sense that certain people exist primarily to serve his needs. My heart sank as I recognized the accuracy of Eleanor's description. I had seen glimpses of that arrogance in David's treatment of restaurant servers, his impatience with store clerks, his dismissive attitude toward anyone he considered beneath his social or professional station. I had told myself it was just the confidence that comes with success, but perhaps I had been willfully blind to something more troubling. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. Because Richard believes David could still change, could still develop the emotional intelligence necessary for true leadership success. But he needs motivation to examine his behavior and make conscious improvements. Right now, David has no incentive to change because his current approach seems to be working. "And you think I might be able to provide that motivation?" Eleanor nodded. "Richard mentioned that you built Sinclair Enterprises from virtually nothing. That kind of success requires not just business acumen, but exceptional people skills. The ability to inspire loyalty and respect from employees, partners, and clients. Those are teachable skills, but only if the student is willing to learn." We talked for another hour, with Eleanor sharing additional observations about David's professional behavior and Richard's concerns about his trajectory. By the time we parted ways, I had a much clearer picture of how David's entitled attitude was beginning to affect his career prospects, even if he hadn't yet realized it himself. That evening, I called Harold to discuss adding another requirement to David's inheritance terms. The original 3 benchmarks focused on financial responsibility, respect for elders, and community service. But Eleanor's conversation had highlighted another crucial area where David needed growth: his treatment of people in service positions and his overall emotional intelligence in professional settings. "I want to add a 4th requirement," I told Harold. "David needs to demonstrate genuine improvement in his interpersonal skills, particularly his treatment of people he perceives as having less power or status. I'm thinking of requiring him to work in a service position for at least 6 months, something that would force him to experience being on the receiving end of customer demands and workplace hierarchy." Harold was quiet for a moment, considering the implications. "That's an interesting addition, Margaret. Many wealthy families have traditions of having their heirs work in entry-level positions to understand business from the ground up. But are you thinking of requiring him to work outside Sinclair Enterprises?" "Absolutely. Working for the family company wouldn't teach him anything because everyone would know who he is and treat him accordingly. He needs to experience what it's like to be judged purely on his performance and attitude, without the protection of his last name or his connections." "Where were you thinking?" I smiled, remembering my own early jobs before Charles and I started the business. Retail, hospitality, food service, something customer-facing where his interpersonal skills would be constantly tested and where poor behavior would have immediate consequences. "The inheritance terms are becoming quite comprehensive," Harold observed. 5 requirements total: financial independence, respect for elders, community service, emotional intelligence development, and waiting until age 50 if he chooses. Not to meet the earlier conditions. "David is inheriting more than money, Harold. He's inheriting a legacy, a company that employs thousands of people, a fortune that comes with enormous social responsibility. I want to make sure he's worthy of that inheritance, not just entitled to it." After we hung up, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on the back terrace, looking out over the garden that had been my sanctuary for so many years. The October evening was crisp, but not yet cold, and the changing leaves created a tapestry of gold and crimson against the darkening sky. My phone buzzed with a text from David. "Dinner this weekend? There's something I want to discuss with you." I stared at the message, wondering what he wanted to discuss. Had Richard spoken to him about his behavior? Had someone else observed his treatment of service staff and offered feedback? Or was this simply another casual dinner invitation, the kind of routine contact that maintained the appearance of a close relationship without requiring any real emotional investment? I texted back, "Sunday at 6. I'll cook." David's response came quickly. "Great. Looking forward to it." I spent the weekend preparing for our conversation, uncertain whether to tell him about the inheritance changes immediately or wait to see what he wanted to discuss. Part of me hoped he had reached his own conclusions about his behavior, that our conversation after his promotion dinner had prompted some genuine self-reflection. But a larger part of me suspected this dinner would be another opportunity for David to demonstrate exactly why the new inheritance terms were necessary. Sunday evening arrived cool and clear, with the kind of October weather that made Westchester County look like a magazine cover. I had prepared David's favorite meal: roasted chicken with herbs from my garden, garlic mashed potatoes, and the green beans he had loved since childhood. It was comfort food, the kind of meal that evoked memories of family dinners and simpler times. David arrived precisely at 6, carrying a bottle of expensive wine and wearing the cashmere sweater I had given him for his last birthday. He looked handsome and successful, every inch the rising executive he had worked so hard to become. But there was something in his expression, a calculation that made me wary of whatever conversation he had planned. "Everything smells amazing," he said, kissing my cheek and heading directly to the wine refrigerator to chill his bottle. "I missed your cooking." "You could have it more often if you visited more frequently," I replied, stirring the gravy. I know. The new position is keeping me incredibly busy. Richard has me leading 3 major client accounts, and there's talk of additional responsibilities in the new year." We made small talk through dinner, with David sharing details about his work and asking polite questions about my own activities. But I could sense his underlying tension, the way he was building up to whatever conversation he had really come to have. Finally, over dessert and coffee, he got to the point. "Mom, I've been thinking about our conversation a couple weeks ago, about respect and gratitude and all that. And you're right. I could probably be more appreciative of everything you've done for me." I waited, sensing there was more coming. "The thing is," David continued, "I'm 38 years old, and I'm starting to think about my own financial independence, my own legacy. I know I have the trust fund that transfers when I turn 40, but I was wondering if you'd considered accelerating that timeline." And there it was. The real reason for his invitation, his careful preparation of my favorite meal, his uncharacteristic acknowledgement of my sacrifices. David wanted early access to his inheritance. "Why would you want to accelerate the timeline?" I asked carefully. "Well, there are some investment opportunities that Richard has mentioned, some real estate deals that could significantly expand the portfolio value. But they require substantial capital, more than I can access through my current monthly allowance." Monthly allowance. At 38 years old, my son was still receiving a monthly allowance like a teenager, and apparently, it wasn't enough to fund the lifestyle he wanted to maintain. "What kind of investment opportunities?" I asked. David launched into an enthusiastic description of a luxury condominium development in Miami, a project backed by several of Morrison and Associates' wealthiest clients. The initial investment required $2 million, but David was convinced it would double within 3 years. He had spreadsheets and projections, testimonials from other investors, even architectural renderings of the finished buildings. "It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity," he concluded. "But I need to commit the capital within the next month, and my current allowance won't cover it." I sipped my coffee, processing everything he had told me. David, you're asking me to give you early access to $2 million so you can invest in a real estate development project? Not give. It's my inheritance anyway. I'm just asking for early access to a portion of it. And if the investment fails? If the development doesn't perform as projected? David waved away my concerns. Richard has vetted all the numbers. These guys know what they're doing. Besides, real estate in Miami is basically guaranteed to appreciate. I thought about the inheritance terms that Harold had finalized the previous week, the requirements that David would need to meet before gaining access to any of his inheritance before age 50. He had no idea what was coming, no understanding that his casual request for $2 million was about to become significantly more complicated. David, I need you to understand something. Your inheritance isn't just money sitting in an account waiting for you to turn 40. It's a legacy that comes with responsibilities, expectations, and yes, requirements. What kind of requirements? I took a deep breath, knowing that what I was about to tell him would fundamentally change our relationship and probably destroy the comfortable dinner we had been sharing. I've made some changes to the inheritance terms, David. Changes that will require you to demonstrate certain qualities before you gain access to your inheritance, regardless of your age. The color drained from his face. What kind of changes? The automatic transfer at 40 has been moved to 50. If you want to inherit earlier, you'll need to meet specific benchmarks that prove you understand the value of money, the importance of respecting others, and the responsibilities that come with wealth. David set down his coffee cup carefully, and I could see him struggling to process what I had just told him. You changed my inheritance terms without telling me? It's my inheritance to change, David. The money you're expecting to receive was earned through decades of work, sacrifice, and careful financial management. I have every right to ensure it goes to someone who will use it responsibly. What? Specific benchmarks? His voice was tight with controlled anger. I explained each requirement: the 2 years of financial independence without family support, the community service and work with elderly populations, the charitable commitment, and the new addition of working in a service position to develop better interpersonal skills. With each requirement I listed, David's expression grew darker. By the time I finished, he was staring at me with undisguised fury. You're punishing me for one comment at a work dinner, he said finally. One moment when I was stressed and spoke, without thinking carefully. This isn't about one comment, David. This is about a pattern of behavior that's been developing for years. The entitlement, the disrespect, the assumption that other people exist primarily to serve your needs. That comment at dinner was just the moment I finally acknowledged what had been happening for a long time. So, because I asked you to be mindful of professional context at my promotion dinner, you're going to force me to work as a waiter or a cashier. You're going to make me live on my salary alone for 2 years. I'm going to require you to develop the character traits that will make you worthy of inheriting a fortune, I corrected. The same character traits that built that fortune in the first place. David stood abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the garden. This is insane, Mom. You're treating me like a child who needs to be taught a lesson. You're acting like a child who needs to be taught a lesson. David, you asked for $2 million tonight as if it were pocket change. You have no understanding of what it took to earn that money. No appreciation for the sacrifices that created your comfortable lifestyle. No recognition that wealth comes with responsibilities beyond your own pleasure. I work hard, he protested. I've built a successful career. You've built a successful career with every advantage I could provide. The best education, the right connections, the financial security that allowed you to take risks and pursue opportunities without fear of failure. Now I'm asking you to prove you can succeed based on your own merit, your own character, your own ability to treat others with respect and dignity. David turned back to face me, his expression a mixture of anger and disbelief. And if I refuse? If I decide these requirements are unreasonable? Then you'll inherit everything when you turn 50, with no conditions attached. 12 years from now. 12 years to mature, to develop perspective, to hopefully become the man your father and I always believed you could be. We stared at each other across the dining room, the comfortable family dinner completely forgotten. I could see David calculating, trying to determine whether I was bluffing, whether this was some kind of negotiating tactic that would disappear if he expressed enough outrage. "You know what I think?" he said finally. "I think you're lonely. I think you're getting older and you're afraid of losing control, so you're using the inheritance to manipulate me into spending more time with you, into making you feel important and needed." His words stung, not because they were true, but because they revealed how fundamentally he misunderstood my motivations. "David, if I wanted to manipulate you into spending time with me, I wouldn't require you to work with other elderly people or serve customers in retail positions. I'd simply require you to visit me more often." Then what is this really about? I walked to the mantelpiece, where a photograph of Charles holding infant David sat next to images of David's graduation. From Princeton, his first job promotion, all the milestones that had marked his journey to adulthood. "This is about saving you from becoming someone your father wouldn't recognize," I said quietly. Charles was the most generous, humble man I ever knew. He treated everyone with respect, regardless of their position or status. He understood that success was a privilege that came with obligations to help others, and he raised you to share those values. "Dad would understand that business requires different skills than charity work," David argued. "He'd support my career advancement. Your father built our first factory with his own hands, David. He knew the name of every employee, asked about their families, attended their children's graduations and their parents' funerals. When he negotiated contracts, his word was accepted, without question, because everyone knew Charles Sinclair's integrity was absolute." I turned back to face him. "The man who spoke to me at your promotion dinner, who suggested I didn't know how to act my age, who's asking for $2 million to fund a speculative investment. That man bears no resemblance to the son Charles." Sinclair raised. David was quiet for a long moment, and I hoped I had finally broken through his defensive anger to reach something deeper. But when he spoke, his voice was cold and distant. "Fine. You want to play games with my inheritance? I'll play along, but don't expect me to pretend this is about my character development. This is about an aging woman who's afraid of becoming irrelevant, who's using emotional manipulation to maintain control over her adult son's life." He grabbed his coat from the chair where he had draped it hours earlier, when this had still seemed like a pleasant family dinner. "I'll meet your requirements, Mom, every single one of them. And when I do, when I prove that I can jump through whatever hoops you've designed, I want you to remember that you destroyed our relationship for no reason other than your own fear of letting go." David. But he was already walking toward the door, leaving behind the wine he had brought, the comfortable evening we had shared, and apparently any pretense that he understood or accepted my motivations. I heard his car start in the driveway, listened to the sound fade as he drove back toward the city and his penthouse apartment and his life of privilege and comfort. And then I sat alone in the dining room, surrounded by the remnants of a dinner that had changed everything between us. Rosa would arrive in the morning to find the dishes still in the sink, the leftovers still sitting on the counter, evidence of a conversation that had shattered any illusion that David and I could continue, pretending our relationship was healthy and respectful. But as painful as the evening had been, I felt a strange sense of relief. The inheritance terms were no longer a secret, no longer a plan I was developing in private. David knew exactly what was required of him, exactly what he needed to do to prove he was worthy of the legacy Charles and I had built. Now we would all find out what kind of man he really was. 3 months had passed since our disastrous dinner conversation, and David had kept his word about meeting my requirements, though not in the way I had hoped. Instead of approaching the challenges with humility and genuine desire for growth, he had tackled them like a corporate project to be managed and completed as efficiently as possible. Harold updated me monthly on David's progress through the Board of Trustees, and while he was technically fulfilling the letter of each requirement, the spirit of transformation I had hoped for seemed entirely absent. The financial independence requirement had been the easiest for him to manipulate. David had moved out of his expensive Manhattan penthouse and into a modest one-bedroom apartment in Queens, trading his luxury lifestyle for something that fit within his Morrison and Associates salary. But rather than learning to live modestly, he had simply shifted his spending patterns. Instead of expensive restaurants, he hosted dinner parties where guests brought wine and ingredients. Instead of designer clothing, he shopped at high-end consignment stores. He had found ways to maintain his social status while technically living within his means, missing entirely the point about understanding financial struggle and developing appreciation for money's true value. The community service requirement had become an exercise in networking disguised as charity work. David had volunteered with Meals on Wheels, delivering food to elderly shut-ins throughout the city, but had somehow managed to turn even this into a professional advantage. Several of the seniors he served were retired executives from major corporations, and David had parlayed their gratitude into business connections and referrals for Morrison and Associates. His supervisor there, a woman named Catherine Wells, had called Harold's office to express concerns about David's motivations, noting that he seemed more interested in the recipients' professional backgrounds than their actual needs. The work requirement had been the most challenging for David to game, partly because I had been very specific about the type of position he needed to accept. He was currently 3 months into a job as a customer service representative at Prestige Electronics, a high-end retail chain that sold computers and home theater systems to affluent customers. The position required him to work evenings and weekends, helping customers choose equipment, processing orders, and handling complaints. His manager, a young woman named Aisha Patel who had no idea about David's background, had been providing monthly feedback to Harold's office as part of the inheritance monitoring process. According to Aisha's reports, David was technically competent, but struggled significantly with customers who challenged his recommendations or demanded services beyond his immediate ability to provide. He had difficulty accepting criticism from customers, often becoming defensive when his expertise was questioned, and had been formally counseled twice for inappropriate responses to difficult situations. Most telling was Aisha's observation that David seemed to view the job as a temporary inconvenience rather than an opportunity to develop genuine customer service skills. The charitable commitment had become David's most cynical manipulation of my requirements. He had established a foundation called the Sinclair Leadership Initiative, ostensibly focused on mentoring young professionals from underprivileged backgrounds. The foundation existed primarily on paper, with David serving as its sole board member and primary spokesperson. He had organized exactly one event, a networking mixer at an upscale Manhattan hotel where young professionals could meet established executives. The event had cost nearly $15,000 to host and had served fewer than 30 mentees, most of whom were already well connected through other professional organizations. Harold had expressed frustration with David's approach during our monthly progress meetings. "He's meeting the technical requirements," Harold had explained during our most recent conversation, "but he's doing so in ways that demonstrate exactly the kind of character flaws you were hoping to address." "What about the Board of Trustees?" I had asked. "What's their assessment?" The board consisted of 3 individuals I had chosen specifically for their wisdom and integrity. Dr. Elizabeth Martinez, a retired psychology professor who specialized in character development; James Chen, a successful entrepreneur who had built his company from nothing; and Reverend Michael Thompson, a community leader who had spent 40 years working with people from all economic backgrounds. They met quarterly to review David's progress and had the authority to determine whether He was fulfilling the spirit as well as the letter of each requirement. They're unanimous in their assessment that David is gaming the system, Harold had reported. Dr. Martinez in particular has expressed concerns about his fundamental approach to the requirements. She believes he's treating them as obstacles to overcome rather than opportunities for genuine growth. Now, as I sat in my garden on a warm March morning, I was preparing for a conversation that would determine whether David's technical compliance was sufficient or whether additional measures were needed. Harold had scheduled a formal review meeting for later that week, where the board would present their findings and recommendations. David would be invited to present his case for why he should be considered to have met the inheritance requirements. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. David's name appeared on the screen, and I experienced the familiar mixture of hope and apprehension that had characterized our limited interactions over the past 3 months. "Hello, David." "Mom, I wanted to give you a heads up about the review meeting on Friday. I've prepared a comprehensive presentation about everything I've accomplished over the past 3 months, and I think you'll be impressed with the results." His tone was confident, almost triumphant, as if he had successfully completed a challenging business project rather than engaged in a process of personal growth and character development. "I'm sure you've worked very hard," I replied carefully. "I've done exactly what you asked," David continued. "I've lived within my salary, I've worked with elderly people, I've taken a retail job, and I've established a charitable organization. I've documented everything, gathered testimonials, and compiled metrics that demonstrate my commitment to meeting your requirements." Metrics, testimonials, documentation. David was approaching his character development like a performance review, complete with quantifiable deliverables and measurable outcomes. "David, these requirements weren't meant to be a checklist to complete. They were designed to help you develop genuine empathy, humility, and appreciation for others." "And I have developed those things," he insisted. "Working with elderly clients has given me a new perspective on aging and wisdom. The retail job has taught me about customer service and conflict resolution. The foundation has allowed me to give back to the community in a meaningful way. I've grown tremendously as a person over these past 3 months." I closed my eyes, recognizing the polished corporate speak that had replaced any authentic reflection on his experiences. "Tell me about Mrs. Henderson," I said quietly. There was a pause. "Who?" "Mrs. Henderson. She's one of the Meals on Wheels recipients you serve. Catherine Wells mentioned that she specifically requested not to be on your route anymore after you spent an entire visit questioning her about her late husband's position at IBM instead of focusing on her current needs." Another pause, longer this time. "Mom, I don't remember every individual client. I serve dozens of people every week." "That's exactly the problem, David. These aren't clients or networking opportunities. They're human beings who deserve your full attention and genuine care, not your professional curiosity about their connections." "I think you're being unfair," David replied, his voice taking on the defensive edge I had come to recognize. "I've made sacrifices to meet your requirements. I've given up my apartment, my lifestyle, my free time. I've worked retail jobs where customers treat me like an idiot, dealt with elderly people who repeat the same stories over and over, and pretended to care about charity work that doesn't actually accomplish anything meaningful." Pretended to? Care. There it was, the admission that revealed everything about David's approach to the requirements. "David, if you've been pretending to care about helping others, then you've missed the entire point of this process. The point was to jump through hoops to get my inheritance back," he shot back. "And I've jumped through every single hoop you created. The board can nitpick my motivations all they want, but I've done everything you asked." We ended the call, without resolving anything, and I spent the rest of the morning walking through the garden, thinking about the conversation ahead and what it might mean for David's future. Charles had always believed that people could change, that given the right motivation and opportunities, anyone could develop greater wisdom and compassion. But he had also been realistic about human nature. understanding that lasting change required genuine desire rather than external pressure. Friday morning arrived gray and rainy, appropriate weather for what I suspected would be a difficult conversation. The meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock at Harold's office, with all parties present: David, myself, Harold, and the 3 board members. I dressed carefully in a navy suit that projected both authority and approachability, knowing that this conversation would likely determine the trajectory of my relationship with David for years to come. Harold's conference room had been arranged with a large oval table that allowed everyone to see each other clearly. David arrived exactly on time, carrying a leather portfolio and wearing his most expensive suit. He looked every inch the successful executive, which was probably exactly the image he wanted to project. Dr. Martinez, James Chen, and Reverend Thompson were already seated when David and I entered. I had worked with these 3 individuals on various charitable projects over the years and trusted their judgment implicitly. They had agreed to serve on the board specifically because they understood the complexities of wealth, family dynamics, and character development. "Thank you all for making time for this review," Harold began once everyone was settled. "As you know, we're here to assess David's progress toward meeting the requirements for early access to his inheritance. David, would you like to begin with your presentation?" David opened his portfolio and removed a bound document that looked disturbingly like a business proposal. "Thank you, Harold. Over the past 3 months, I've made significant strides in all 4 required areas, and I believe the evidence clearly demonstrates my readiness to assume control of my inheritance." He proceeded to present his case with the same polished confidence he probably used in client meetings at Morrison and Associates. He had charts showing his reduced monthly expenses, testimonials from Meals on Wheels supervisors about his reliability, performance reviews from Prestige Electronics documenting his customer service metrics, and a detailed plan for expanding the Sinclair Leadership Initiative. "In conclusion," David said, closing his presentation folder, "I've not only met the technical requirements established by the inheritance terms, but I've exceeded them in several areas. I've learned valuable lessons about financial responsibility, developed deeper appreciation for older adults, gained hands-on experience in customer service, and created a sustainable charitable organization that will continue benefiting the community for years to come." The room was quiet for a moment after David finished. Then Dr. Martinez leaned forward, her expression thoughtful but serious. "David, thank you for that comprehensive presentation. I have a few questions about your experiences. Can you tell us about a specific moment when working with elderly clients changed your perspective on aging or challenged your assumptions about older adults?" David's confident expression flickered slightly. "Well, there have been many such moments. Working with seniors has given me tremendous respect for their wisdom and experience." "I'm looking for a specific example," Dr. Martinez pressed gently. "A particular conversation or interaction that stands out as meaningful or transformative." David shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable with the request for genuine personal reflection rather than polished corporate messaging. "There was an elderly gentleman, Mr. Rodriguez, who told me about his experience starting a business in the 1960s with limited English and no formal education. It was inspiring to hear about his determination and success." "And how did that conversation change your approach to your own work or relationships?" Dr. Martinez continued. "It reinforced my appreciation for the immigrant experience and the importance of hard work in achieving success." James Chen spoke up. "David, I've reviewed the financial documentation you provided, and I'm impressed with your ability to live within your salary constraints. But can you tell us about a time when the financial limitations forced you to make a difficult choice or helped you understand the stress that ordinary people face when money is tight?" Again, David's response was generic and impersonal. "Living on a budget has definitely given me greater appreciation for financial planning and the importance of making thoughtful spending decisions." "But have you experienced genuine financial stress?" James pressed, Have you ever worried about making rent or buying groceries? Have you had to choose between necessities because you couldn't afford both? Well, no, David admitted. But I've been much more conscious of my spending choices. Reverend Thompson leaned forward with a gentle smile. David, I understand. You've established a charitable foundation. Can you tell us about someone whose life has been meaningfully impacted by your work with the organization? David brightened, apparently feeling more confident about this topic. The Sinclair Leadership Initiative has already connected dozens of young professionals with established mentors in their fields. The networking opportunities alone have been invaluable for these emerging leaders. I'm more interested in personal transformation than professional networking, Reverend Thompson clarified. Can you share a story about someone whose circumstances or outlook changed because of your charitable work? David's pause grew longer, and I could see him struggling to find an example that would satisfy the question. Finally, he offered a vague story about a young woman who had gained confidence through attending the foundation's networking event, but his account lacked the specific details and emotional connection that would suggest genuine involvement in her progress. The questioning continued for another 30 minutes, with each board member probing different aspects of David's experiences. What became increasingly clear was that while David had technically completed all the required activities, he had done so in a way that insulated him from the genuine challenges and growth opportunities they were designed to provide. When the GI board members finished their questions, Harold turned to me. Margaret, do you have anything you'd like to add? I looked at my son. This accomplished, intelligent man who had somehow missed every lesson the requirements were meant to teach. David, I want you to understand that I'm not disappointed in what you've accomplished over the past 3 months. You've demonstrated discipline, determination, and the ability to adapt to challenging circumstances. David's expression brightened, apparently interpreting my words as approval. However, I continued, you've also demonstrated that you're still approaching life as a series of problems to be solved rather than experiences to learn from. You've found ways to complete each requirement while avoiding the personal growth they were designed to foster. Mom, I've met every single condition you established, David protested. I've documented everything, exceeded expectations in multiple areas, and proven my commitment to change. Dr. Martinez spoke softly. David, change isn't something that can be documented or measured through metrics. It's an internal transformation that shows up in how you treat others, how you view your place in the world, and how you respond to challenges and setbacks. Based on our interviews with your supervisors and the people you've worked with, James Chen added, it's clear that you've approached these requirements as tasks to complete rather than opportunities to develop genuine empathy and humility. You've been serving meals to elderly people for 3 months, Reverend Thompson observed, but you still don't know Mrs. Henderson's first name or why she looks forward to your visits. You've been working in retail for 3 months, but you still view difficult customers as obstacles rather than human beings having challenging days. David's composure was beginning to crack. So what are you saying? That nothing I've done counts? That I have to start over? Harold cleared his throat. The board has discussed this extensively, and we've reached a unanimous decision. While you've technically completed the required activities, you haven't demonstrated the character growth that would justify early access to your inheritance. However, Dr. Martinez continued, we don't believe you should start over completely. Instead, we're recommending a modified approach that builds on what you've already experienced. James Chen opened a folder and removed a document. We're proposing an additional year of requirements, but with a different structure designed to address the gaps in your current approach. An additional year? David's voice rose with disbelief. You're moving the goalposts because you don't like my attitude? We're providing you with additional opportunities to develop the character traits that will serve you well as the steward of a significant fortune, Reverend Thompson replied calmly. Harold began reading from the document. For the next 12 months, you'll continue working at Prestige Electronics, but with a specific focus on developing genuine customer service skills and receiving positive feedback from difficult customers. You'll continue with Meals on Wheels, but you'll be assigned to clients who specifically requested compassionate, attentive volunteers. You'll expand the Sinclair Leadership Initiative to include hands-on mentoring relationships that require substantial time investment in individual participants. Additionally, Dr. Martinez added, you'll begin monthly meetings with a counselor who specializes in empathy development and emotional intelligence. These sessions will focus on helping you understand the difference between completing tasks and developing genuine concern for others. David stared at the board members, then at me, his expression cycling through disbelief, anger, and something that might have been genuine distress. This is insane. You're treating me like a criminal who needs rehabilitation instead of a successful professional who completed your arbitrary requirements. David, I said gently, these requirements aren't arbitrary. They're designed to ensure that when you inherit this fortune, you'll use it in ways that honor the values your father and I tried to instill in you. Dad would be appalled by this, David shot back. He'd be horrified that you're using emotional manipulation to control my life. Your father spent his entire adult life treating every person he encountered with dignity and respect, I replied. He would be proud that you're being given additional opportunities to develop those same qualities. David gathered his presentation materials, shoving them into his portfolio with sharp, angry movements. Fine, I'll complete your additional requirements. I'll jump through whatever new hoops you create. But I want you to understand that you're destroying our relationship for no reason other than your own need to maintain control. He stood abruptly, not waiting for anyone to respond. I'll fulfill every single requirement you establish, and when I do, when I prove that I can manipulate whatever system you create, I want my inheritance transferred immediately. No additional delays, no new requirements, no further opportunities for character development. David, Dr. Martinez called as he reached the door. Genuine change can't be forced or manipulated. It can only come from recognizing that other people's well-being matters as much as your own. But David was already gone, leaving behind only the echo of his footsteps in the hallway and the uncomfortable silence of people who had witnessed a profound failure of understanding. I'm sorry you had to see that, I said to the board members. I had hoped that even if David approached the requirements strategically, he might accidentally discover some genuine growth along the way. Character development is rarely a linear process, Reverend Thompson replied kindly. Some people need multiple opportunities to understand that external change without internal transformation is meaningless. The additional year will either prompt genuine growth or confirm that David isn't ready for the responsibilities that come with inheriting significant wealth, James Chen added. Either outcome serves the ultimate goal of ensuring the money goes to someone who will use it wisely. Dr. Martinez gathered her notes. Margaret, I want you to know that what you're doing takes tremendous courage. It would be easier to simply transfer the inheritance and hope for the best, but you're prioritizing David's long-term character development over short-term family harmony. After the board members left, Harold and I remained in the conference room, processing what had just occurred. Do you think there's any chance this additional year will make a difference? I asked. Harold considered the question carefully. David is clearly intelligent and capable of learning. Whether he chooses to learn the lessons you're trying to teach depends entirely on whether he can move past his anger and resentment to recognize that these requirements are opportunities rather than punishments. And if he can't, then he'll inherit everything at 50, and you'll have done everything possible to prepare him for that responsibility. I drove home through the spring afternoon, thinking about the conversation and what it revealed, about the choices ahead. David could continue approaching the requirements as obstacles to overcome, in which case he would likely spend the next 12 years angry and resentful. Or he could recognize that genuine character development would benefit him regardless of when he inherited, in which case the additional year might prompt the transformation I had always hoped for. That evening, I received a call from Eleanor Morrison. She had heard through Richard about David's retail job and his increasingly obvious frustration with his circumstances. "Richard is concerned," Eleanor reported. "David's work performance at Morrison and Associates has declined noticeably over the past month. He seems distracted, occasionally short-tempered with colleagues, and less engaged with client relationships." "How serious is the decline?" "Serious enough that Richard is considering whether David is the right fit for the additional responsibilities they had been planning to offer him. Richard believes that someone who can't handle personal stress without letting it affect their professional performance isn't ready for senior leadership roles." The irony wasn't lost on me. David's resentment about the inheritance requirements was undermining his professional success, creating exactly the kind of character-based career limitations that the requirements were designed to address. "Has Richard spoken to David about these concerns?" "Not yet, but he's planning to have a conversation soon. Richard wanted to give you a heads up because he knows David might blame you for any professional setbacks." After we hung up, I sat in Charles's study, looking at the photographs that chronicled David's journey from sweet child to frustrated adult. Somewhere in those years between his college graduation and his promotion dinner, I had failed to help him develop the emotional maturity necessary for handling disappointment and setbacks gracefully. But perhaps it wasn't too late. Perhaps the additional year of requirements, combined with the professional consequences of his current attitude, might finally prompt David to recognize that character development wasn't something imposed by others, but something necessary for any form of lasting success. My phone buzzed with a text from David. "I'll meet your new requirements, but when I inherit at 50, I'm cutting all contact. You've chosen control over family, and I won't forget that." I stared at the message for a long time, feeling the weight of the choice I had made and the risks it entailed. There was a real possibility that David would never forgive me for establishing these requirements, that our relationship would never recover from the conflicts of the past year. But there was also a possibility that David would eventually understand that everything I had done was motivated by love rather than control, by hope for his future rather than fear of losing influence over his choices. I typed back, "I love you, David. Everything I've done has been because I believe you're capable of becoming an extraordinary man who uses his advantages to help others, rather than simply advancing himself." His response came quickly. "We'll see." 2 months later, I was working in the garden when Rosa brought me the phone. "It's Mr. David," she said, her expression carefully neutral. "Mom?" David's voice sounded different, less certain than usual. "Hello, David. How are you?" "I wanted to tell you about something that happened at work yesterday. A customer came in looking for a sound system for his daughter's wedding reception. He had a very limited budget, maybe $300 total, but he wanted something that would make the day special for her." I waited, sensing there was more to the story. My first instinct was to try to upsell him to a more expensive system, to explain why his budget wouldn't buy anything worthwhile. But then I remembered what Aisha had said about really listening to what customers need, rather than focusing on what we want to sell them. David paused, and I could hear something in his voice that hadn't been there in months. Genuine reflection, rather than defensive justification. So I spent an hour with him, figuring out exactly what would work in their venue, what features mattered most for their situation. I found a system that fit his budget perfectly, even helped him pick out the right accessories. When he left, he thanked me about 5 times and said I had made his daughter's wedding possible. "How did that feel?" I asked softly. "Good," David admitted. "Really good, actually. Better than any commission I've ever earned." It was a small moment, a single interaction that might not represent lasting change, but for the first time in months, I heard genuine satisfaction in David's voice rather than anger or resentment. "I'm proud of you," I said. "It's just one customer," David replied. but I could hear something like hope in his voice. One customer, who will remember your kindness for the rest of his life. One father whose daughter's wedding was made more special because you chose to help, rather than simply sell. We talked for a few more minutes, and while David didn't apologize for his previous anger or acknowledge the value of the inheritance requirements, there was a subtle shift in his tone that suggested genuine experience rather than strategic compliance. After we hung up, I walked through the garden, thinking about the conversation and what it might represent. Change was rarely dramatic or sudden. More often, it was a series of small moments when someone chose empathy over self-interest, service over profit, connection over control. David still had 10 months of additional requirements ahead of him, and there would undoubtedly be setbacks and frustrations along the way. But for the first time since our dinner conversation, I felt genuine hope that the process might lead to the transformation I had always believed was possible. Whether that transformation would be enough to repair our relationship remained to be seen, but at least David was finally beginning to understand that the requirements weren't about punishment or control. They were about helping him become worthy of inheriting not just money, but a legacy of compassion, integrity, and genuine concern for others. The woman who had built Sinclair Enterprises from nothing understood that the most valuable inheritance she could leave her son wasn't financial wealth, but the character necessary to use that wealth in ways that would make his father proud. And perhaps, finally, David was beginning to understand that too. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.